War has always been a place of bold innovation and wild gambles. But every now and then, a plan comes along that is so truly bizarre, it sounds more like a joke than an actual military strategy. In 1862, during the early days of the American Civil War, one Union officer came up with an idea that was as daring as it was unconventional. It involved a nighttime operation, a group of unsuspecting mules, and a whole ton of explosives. In today's episode, we'll see just how, as with many ambitious war plans, things don't always go quite as expected. These are the strange but true stories from a history of conflict that you never learned about in school. I'm your host, Nick Charlie Key, and this is the wild history of war. If you aren't already a Patreon supporter, but you are already hooked on these wild, weird, and unbelievable true stories from wartime history, well then you're going to love what I have in store for you. When you join the Wild History of War on Patreon, you not only unlock early access to episodes, you get a ton of other rewards and exclusive bonus content that is only for subscribers. When you first sign up, you'll get a personal shout out in an upcoming episode and your name forever etched on our wall of supporters over on our website. You'll also get an exclusive mini episode once a month, as well as a companion guide for every episode released on the main feed, which includes bonus facts, key character breakdowns, and even rare images from each incredible story. Beyond that, you can even get special access to ad-free episodes, free branded t-shirts or caps, the ability to vote on future episode topics, and at the highest level, even an executive producer credit. So, dive deeper into this wonderful, wild world of history with me. You can do so by clicking the link in the episode description or over on our website at wildhistoryofwar.com. Now, back to the episode. James Paddy Graydon was born in 1832 in a remote village in the Irish countryside. As a teenager, he and his family emigrated to America with the hope of finding work and the promise of a better life. Things would, unfortunately, not go exactly to plan in this regard, and so, at the age of 21, struggling as he was just to survive, he joined up with the US Army. He found himself a natural fit in this new environment, and soon had been elevated to the Army's elite 1st Dragoons unit in early 1853. For years, he moved around different forts and stations all across the American West, and in 1858, at just 26 years of age, he was already considered a seasoned veteran of the frontier campaigns. Even for someone so young, he commanded a lot of respect from those around him, owing in large part to his exploits on the battlefield. In campaigns against the Apaches, Navajos, and even the odd outlaw raid, his men came to know him as both fearless and reliable. But while he may have been those two things, the men who knew him were also quick to add that he had an ego big enough to match. He was described in multiple sources as being arrogant, a braggart, and an unstoppable daredevil. And yet ask any of them, and they would all say that they revered him. Paddy, however, decided that he'd grown weary of the military life, and so decided to pack up his things and use the little money he had earned to settle down in a little town near Fort Buchanan in Arizona. There, he would open his own hotel and saloon. His establishment became rather popular, and if you've seen any kind of Wild West movie, it was pretty much exactly like one of those. Rooms upstairs, bar downstairs, 24-hour poker games, horse stables, and a gin distillery out the back, not to mention the affordable company of the women in his employ. Gunfights were a regular occurrence, and full tavern brawls happened about once a week. The money was good, and the living was easy. Paddy was still well known in the area as a man who could handle himself in a fight, and was someone you could count on to get the job done. So, naturally, local law enforcement would often come to him, looking for assistance in rounding up horse thieves and murderers, while also accompanying them in running down Native American raiding parties and rescuing hostages. These escapades kept him sharp, and so after just 3 years of this new life, it was maybe no surprise that Paddy began contemplating a return to action, and he wouldn't have to wait long. On the 12th of April, 1861, the American Civil War broke out, and Paddy knew he didn't want to miss out. He left his hotel and saloon in the care of someone else and immediately set out for New Mexico to offer his services to the Union Army. Owing to his elite experience mixed with his tracking and special operations work in the intervening years, he was commissioned to recruit 100 of the hardest men he could find, and with them create a specialist company of spies who would work under his command alone, virtually independent from the Union Army command structures. Now, at the same time as all of this was happening, Confederate forces in Texas were beginning to mobilize their own forces. For many years, they had claimed large swathes of New Mexico as their own, but up until the war broke out, had no official means by which to claim it. Now, unconstrained by the Compromise of 1850, these Confederate Texans marched into southeastern New Mexico in July 1861, claiming it for themselves. Over the next 6 months, more and more Confederate forces began to join them, until in February 1862, a Confederate brigadier general by the name of Henry Hopkins Sibley decided the time had come to mobilize. He led 2,500 of these men, calling themselves the Army of New Mexico, in a broad-reaching campaign to not only overrun and claim the rest of the New Mexico territories, but to eventually push all the way to the Colorado goldfields and establish a fort there for themselves. Standing in his way, however, was a group of 1,250 U.S. Army soldiers and a hastily assembled group of 1,350 regional militia who had joined forces under the command of Colonel E.R.S. Canby. Canby's troops had stationed themselves at Fort Craig in south-central New Mexico and awaited the advance of Sibley's Confederate troops. They wouldn't have to wait long, as by the 16th of February, the Texan army had pushed to within just a mile of the fort. Sibley sent out some scouts who reported back to him that there was no way they'd be able to take the fort as it was too well fortified, and they were outnumbered anyway. Sibley, determined to push on, first sent a messenger to Canby, demanding that they come out and face his army on the open plains outside the fort. And as I'm sure you would have too, Canby sent the messenger back with the 1862 equivalent of "lol, get wrecked." Sibley, knowing his options were limited, decided that they would simply retreat south some 7 miles and cross over there back to the east bank of the Rio Grande. They would then turn northwards again, effectively bypassing Fort Craig, going a further 6 miles past them, and then cross the river once again in order to carry on with their campaign, without the fort being in their way. I hope that all made sense, and if not, I'll be putting up a map explaining their movements across my social media channels if you'd like to check that out. But Sibley had miscalculated how long it would take his troops to march the long return journey north to the crossing point at Valverde Ford. He had not accounted for the deep sand and rough terrain that they were set to encounter, and so, on the evening of February 20th, they were forced to make a dry camp for the night. And we're going to take a short break, but when we return, we're going to see how our good friend Paddy Graydon uses what he has at his disposal in an audacious bid to surprise the enemy. Paddy Graydon and his spies had by this point managed to infiltrate some of their covert unit into the Confederate ranks and had been monitoring and assessing their movements, sending regular reports back to Canby at Fort Craig. It wasn't long before Canby received word that the Confederates had had to make an unplanned camp that night and had not had adequate time to set up proper battlements to protect them from attack. Canby, realizing that this was an opportunity too good to pass up, began to mull over his options. They didn't have enough time to get thousands of his men across the river and to their encampment in order to ambush them, But maybe Paddy and his men could come up with a plan to sabotage them in some way. Paddy didn't need to be asked twice. And while he didn't have the numbers for an all-out attack, he did have enough experience and cunning to come up with a truly outlandish plan. Paddy gathered up a few of his men and informed them of his plan. They were going to send some guided missiles into the Confederate camp. Look, sure, he probably didn't use that exact terminology, as they wouldn't be invented for a long time still. But in theory, that's exactly what his plan was. Send a self-propelled explosive device towards an enemy's position. The only difference was, in this case, the self-propelled mechanism of choice were two of his unit's oldest donkeys. He got to work immediately, finding large wooden boxes and a few empty 24-pounder howitzer artillery shells. He poured gunpowder into each of these empty shells, filling them to the brim and then placing them inside the wooden boxes. Fuses were set into each shell and tied together by a single, longer timer fuse that would be lit beforehand. 2 boxes, each one filled with a few packed artillery shells, were tied loosely together with rope. Once they had been securely fastened with some slack in the middle of the boxes, they were lifted up and over the donkey's back, with one box resting on either side of the poor animal's flanks, essentially appearing as if the donkey had 2 incredibly dangerous saddlebags. The donkeys in question, if it helps in any small way, were chosen specifically because of their old age and depleted usefulness to the unit, as they were becoming slower and weaker in general. Paddy saw it as one last grand hurrah for them, and a way to give their lives for the greater good. As the darkness of the night grew ever deeper, Paddy, his men, and their 2 homing missiles waited just out of sight of the Confederate camp. At some point, once it seemed like all but the guards on watch duty had finally gone to sleep that night, Paddy signaled to his men that it was go time. Paddy and 4 of his men set out for the Confederate camp. He led quietly in front with 2 men assigned to each donkey, one on each side of it, to make sure that the wooden boxes full of explosives didn't come loose or jostle around too much. They would proceed very slowly, in part to accommodate the elderly donkeys, but also to make sure that they weren't seen or heard in their approach. Once they had reached a certain point, Paddy held up his hand, signaling his men to stop. This was it. Quietly, and making sure to have his back turned to the Confederate watchman, he lit a match and slowly touched it to the long fuses dangling from the wooden saddlebags. Once they had all been lit, he gave the 2 donkeys one last pat on the nose and then slapped them on the backside and pointing them in the direction of the camp. The theory was that they would be drawn to the lights, the fires, and the smell of cooking food, and then plod their way towards it. Unfortunately for Paddy and his men, this theory turned out to be false. As he and his men scurried as quietly as they could back up the track, they paused behind a rock to catch their breath and laugh about the sheer absurdity of their plan. All of a sudden, his men froze as they heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. Paddy leant out carefully to inspect who was approaching, and to his horror, he was met with 2 large, smiling faces, and the faint hissing sound of fuses slowly making their way towards an enormous payload. It seems that no one had mentioned the plan to the donkeys. They had simply followed their friends back the way they had come. Paddy wasn't sure how long exactly the timer fuses had left, and so in a panic, he and his men set out in a full sprint down the path. The donkeys, obviously thinking this was all great fun and games, summoned whatever energy they had left in their legs and began to gallop behind the fleeing men. Paddy shouted at the donkeys, telling them to stop or turn around, but it was either his thick Irish accent or the fact that neither of the donkeys could speak English. They seemed to completely ignore him. With time running out, he shouted at his 4 men to split up and run in all different directions, and maybe the donkeys would get confused and stop. In a flash, all 5 men split from one another, praying that if the donkeys did end up following, that it wouldn't be after them. Well, this seemed to do the trick, as the donkeys slowed down, trying to work out for themselves which of the men they most wanted to follow. Unfortunately for them, they would never get the chance to find out. An almighty boom erupted from the place where just a second ago 2 donkeys had stood. The force of the blast knocked each of the men to the ground as they continued running, but luckily for them, they'd all made it far enough away so as not to have suffered any injuries. As small bits of charred donkey rained down upon him, Paddy reflected on what in theory had been an amazing plan. But, despite appearances, the operation was not at all a total failure. Unbeknownst to Paddy and his men, the sound of the explosion had rung out so loudly amongst the surrounding hills that it had not only woken up the Confederate troops, all rushing out of their tents expecting to see an approaching army, but it had in fact spooked their own herd of pack donkeys so badly that they all stampeded through the camp and down towards the river. 150 of these terrified animals just so happened to run directly towards another group of Union soldiers, who gratefully rounded them up and swiftly led them across the river towards the safety of Canby's fort. So, while no casualties had been inflicted, besides the 2 poor donkeys of course, what the operation had achieved was a severe hampering of the Confederate Army's ability to move their equipment and supply wagons, making their northward advance even slower than it had already become. So, in the wild, unpredictable chaos of war, sometimes even failure has unexpected benefits. It's a perfect example of how, in war, even the most absurd blunders can shape the course of battle in ways that no one could have predicted. Thank you so much for listening to The Wild History of War. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us and also allows curious minds just like yourself to discover the show. Well, this podcast is written, hosted, and presented by me, Nick Charlie Key. You can keep up with everything we're doing by joining our communities over on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Discord. All of the links are in the show notes or on our website. If you're hungry for more strange tales from history, why don't you check out my other podcast, The Fantastic History of Food. Strange but true stories from history that in some way involve food. Until next time, thanks for listening.